While still new, the Boss Katana series has been making some noise in the guitar world. Well, today we're going to take a look at the bass version. We're going to see if the Boss Bass Katana has what it takes to cut through the competition. Stick around. Hello everybody, this is Carlos with Alamo Music Center here in beautiful downtown San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our videos, and sign up for notifications. So today we're talking about the Boss Katana series. So I'm pretty excited to see what we have to offer from this because there's so many different features built in. Really can't wait to look forward to all of them. So at the time of filming with the Boss Katana series, Boss is offering two versions for their bass amp line. They're offering the 110 and the 210. What you're going to get in the difference is going to be, as the name implies, one has a 10-inch cab in the cab, while the other one has two 10-inch ones. And the output, obviously, 160 for the 210 versus 60 for the 110. And a price difference as well, 400 for the 110, about 750 for the 210. And again, that is at the time of filming, and those prices can be subject to change. But really, those minor things is the only difference between the two of them. They both have the exact same features and things of that nature. So whether you're looking for the 110 or the 210, you need something big or something bigger, either one's gonna have you covered. Only downside I could say in that spectrum is that if you are looking for something smaller, if you're looking for a practice amp, something just for the house, at the time right now, that isn't offered. Now there's many features which we'll talk about that can kind of circumvent that if you do get any of these options, but in general, just the 110 and the 210, two fairly bigger amps are all that's gonna directly be available at the time of filming. So with that in mind, the only difference we're getting is gonna be price, size, and output. What is it that we get? Well, let's talk about it. So this is actually rather unique. I know we don't normally do this. As I mentioned though, there's not too many differences between the two versions of the Katana. So we really want to kind of zone in on where they're similar, and what you're going to be getting similar is going to be all of these options up here. Now normally we tend to usually talk about these and then play them out, and we prefer to kind of do it that way too. But with the Katana, there's just so many features, so many options that it's kind of felt better to just kind of do it in all in one, where we talk about it as we're messing around with it. So let's start off first with just the power control. The one thing I do want to point out that's pretty cool is that this does also feature a max input as well as a 1 watt and a standby. So it is rather convenient to switch from typically gigging to live, or just being able to put on standby without powering it off. But minus those kind of controls, it's actually designed here. As you can see, there's a lot of knobs, but we can show here where they're kind of sectioned off, and it's actually sectioned off in a rather smart chain. So we're going to start from the far left. On the far left, we do have our input effects, which is going to be a dedicated drive right here, as well as also a compressor. Now, we do see multiple different knobs. The bottom knob here does control the compressor, while the top does control the drive. Now, where you see a difference in that is, for example, we have something like when we crank up that compressor all the way up, we have that a little bit more flatter, a little bit more kind of like subtle tone, so it's pretty good. Now, the cool thing about the compressor in that spectrum is that it's not just limited to that directly. Each one of these knobs, which is part of the reason we're doing this way, has additional options that give you more type of molding. So when we push down on the comp button, you see it turns red, and now we have the, and of course yellow, compared to it being the. So we do get those kind of differences in tone just by those additional knobs. And of course, to turn it off, we just simply put it back into that off position. Now, the same thing does go for the drive as well. We're going to crank that drive all the way up. Super duper metal. Little less of that high end on it. You can hear where that one has more of like that scoop going on to it. Let's turn that back off. So it does give you an option in between the drives to give you, well, to be honest, it gives you a really kind of heavy, more of a trebly kind of drive to it, but it does have those different tones to kind of see where it emphasizes in those lows, the mids, and also into scooping onto the highs as well. Now, moving on, as you can see here, we do have something that's actually kind of similar to other series where we have different type of amp moduling, starting with the flat that we have here versus the vintage mode. Now that one's going to give you more of like that warmer tube tape presence, give you kind of like that vintage style 60s tone. Then we do have the modern, which has a little bit more of a mid scoop to it to kind of give you a different tone. So it does play pretty well in having those different styles. Now each one of those in the amplifier, again, can be modified. Let's go ahead and go to modern. We'll just stick with, you know what, I like vintage. Let's stick with vintage. We can crank up that volume. And even how much gain we're getting out of it. Now, in addition to that, of course, we do also see a pad and shape, which does allow you the option to shape the amplifier tone, and a pad as well, to give you a little bit more of a buffer space zone there. So those are pretty cool in that spectrum. That usually what you'll get a lot of the times when an amp will feature some sort of amplifier moduling is that they will have those options. This does go a little extra in giving you the opportunity to even shape those amp tones. And again, this is before we even get into our standard EQ, which we see a 4-band there. Now, with that being said, when we have that drive, we're going to crank that drive up. We're going to put it on vintage and turn on that shape. So you can see here, we do also have the option to dry blend it and put it in together before we even start affecting the tone. Now, just for the sake of being able to hear what these EQs do, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn off all of this good stuff. We don't actually need any of these directly on for right now. Just kind of go back to that smooth tone. So let's go ahead and talk about what we get on the EQ tone next. So with the EQ, what we're looking at here is going to be a 4-band. Now, that's pretty straightforward, and some might be familiar with that in the world of bass amps. We got our bass, our low mid, our high mid, as well as also treble. But another cool factor of it is that, as you can see above that, right below the equalizer, that we have on the low mid and the high mid a green dot. Well, like the rest, those are buttons, and in fact gives you 3 different, per each one of those, sculpting points, which means that it's going to change where exactly on the frequency bend, on the frequency chain, is going to actually cause those scoops to happen. So when we're talking about that low mid boost, we'll crank that up a bit to get a little bit, we're going to crank that up a bit to get a little bit more prominence there. And then when we crank that to the next one, same thing, of course, also occurs on the high mid section. Now, it is important to note, and really good thing though, is that when we're pressing these buttons and we're getting those different changes, we're not really seeing a large jump in the tone, and that's kind of exactly what you want. You don't necessarily want those EQs right there to be these huge gaps. Sometimes what you're looking for is just to change the point in which you're going to sculpt. And I think it does a good job in not jumping all over the place. You know, it's not acting as a boost, it's not acting necessarily as a mid or a scoop. It really is just working as the place where it's going to start engaging on the frequency spectrum. So that's definitely really cool. A lot of the times you may get those high boost, those low boost, or even just the 4-way EQ, but this almost in a sense makes it a little bit more than just your standard 4-way EQ. I mean, you do have those direct control knobs, but with the low mids and the high mids each having 3 different points of where you can scoop, you actually can start blending in, especially when we start talking about moding in your tone with this there, that there, and all these different colors. Basically goes down to that you really have a lot more control over the tone you're trying to get out of your amp with the bass you're using. Now, you can't really see it, or not too well, but what we are playing right now is the Fender Player Plus in the active mode. Doing it just so we can kind of get a neutral tone, something that's not going to be embellished too much. Now, we're not going to talk too much about the effects tab, only because we don't have any of them loaded in. But what this Boss will give you the option to is to have effects built in, effects 1, effects 2, which is going to be things like chorus, flanger, delay, reverb. There's a whole slew of them, up to 60, I believe, that are currently available, that are all imported through the bass editor system, Boss Bass editor system, which is what they use in order to be able to give you additional effects, but more than that, also additional toning and moduling on there. Now, as we see at the top, right before we go ahead and let's talk a little bit more in detail about what you see in the back, as you can see next to the master, we have a volume. But one thing that's unique, at least to this model, and a lot that I haven't seen too much on amps, is that right next to it we do have the optional on and off option for the tweeter. So subtle changes, but it does see where you get a little bit more of like that kind of more traditional bass tone versus something with a little bit more of that kind of growl to it. And on top of that, as you can see here, we also do have channel settings. Cool thing there is you can actually store up to 6 presets utilizing those channel settings, so that way if you do like a certain effect you used, or if you found a good tone you have, you don't have to lose it. You do turn it back on and it's there. Now, one thing that it is important to note is this kind of does operate kind of like how the Spider series did, in the sense that these knobs do engage as they're moved. If you turn it on or set it to a certain level, when you turn it back on, it is going to turn back on to kind of the default settings, which means you will have to move those knobs to where you want them to be. Again, a great option for that is if you do have these tone options, you simply turn it on and switch to the channel you're looking for. Now, just to give you some more effects, let me go ahead and play a little bit. While I play, I'll move around some of the knobs just so you can kind of hear what it can do in those scenarios. All right, so we just got to hear it out, and we don't normally demo stuff out that way. I know we usually try to keep that demo by itself, but as y'all can see with the Katana, it's got a whole slew of features and options that it kind of felt only right to kind of do it in that sense so that we don't really forget any of them. And even with the demo we just did and all of the knobs and finger twiddling and all that stuff, I feel like we still only barely scratched the surface of what the Katana can truly offer in terms of the moldability, sculptability, and just shaping of it. And mind you, we didn't even go into the effects channel tab because we don't have any at this moment preloaded on there or stocked in, but that is a thing on and of itself. So now that we kind of talked about the brain, let's go ahead and talk about the body a bit. So what do we get on there? Now, what we're looking at right now, and you can kind of see it here, is we're looking at the back. Now, the back in and of itself doesn't have a lot of features that are going to be unique to Boss or anything like that, but it does have a few things that may surprise you. So for starters, you may see something that is kind of that we may be familiar with, which is going to be a balanced out. Now, the one thing that I do notice about the bass Boss series and the Katana is that, for better or for worse, it is really overbuilt. And in my opinion, that's for the better, because there is a lot of things that you would not have expected it to have to be to that level, which when you realize they're there, it's going to be great. Like, for example, when we're talking about that ground out, the balanced output out. Well, typically with the balanced out, we always have that. One thing that we don't always have is going to be the option to choose whether we wanted a pre, post, or DI out. It gives us the opportunity to choose exactly what's coming out from the DI, which again, even more sculptability. You may be able to do it so that way the live sound has your clean DI while the amp itself is affecting the actual effects. Or if we're talking about in the studio, that gives you another opportunity to where you can record in the studio, maybe you mic up the front, And in the back, you have a DI. That way you don't have to go through a whole DI channel or have a direct DI or any other splits. You legitimately just have one microphone in the front and your XLR coming out from the back and already easily put. Now, other features that you may see that we're already familiar with, we're gonna have a headphone jack, but that's also gonna function as a record out jack. So in addition to the balanced XLR, you can also plug in your 1/4 inch and just directly interface it in that way. We also do have a power amp in addition to the effects loop send. Now, what's cool down here is that it also features the option for a foot switch. Now, foot switches in general aren't unique to Boss and they're not unique to bass amps in general, but the foot switch it uses is definitely pretty interesting. Now, it doesn't come with the foot switch, but it, as opposed to most bass amps where a foot switch may typically just control your distortion, overdrive, or things of that nature, this actually will go as far as controlling a lot more options, such as what amp model you're on, maybe even the effects you're on, and depending on how you coordinate it, it can even change channels as well too. Again, that is an optional thing, doesn't come included, but it does have that option for you to use it for Boss. Now, where this shines, at least separates itself from the pack, is gonna be two things. Number one, these two right here, USB port, and this is covered up, but it's also the Boss dual MIDI audio Bluetooth adapter. So what does that mean? So let's start with the USB port. So we're seeing I believe they're called a D-cord or D-cord, something like that, but we're seeing a USB. You may be familiar with seeing this with your audio interface or your printer, but you plug it up USB, and from there what it allows you to do is not just use the Boss media editor, which will allow you to sculpt your tone, which will allow you to add effects into it, but it also will interface with recording software as well by utilizing it through there and their own internal bass emulators that they have. So another really cool option. Those same type of sculptability can be done via your phone and Bluetooth by getting a separate adapter, which I believe at the time of filming is around the $50, $60 range. But by using that adapter and adding it to the back of this, you'll be able to do sculpting through the Boss tone editor on your phone. Now, that right there that I'm mentioning is probably where it also separates itself a lot from your Korgs, Ampegs, Fenders, and other stuff, is by the Boss tone editor. And probably one of the better things that this amp has for it is its connection to Boss. Boss, of course, obviously more well known for their pedals. They take that same type of technology and knowledge that they have in making their pedals and use it so that way you can import effects into your amp and have onboard effects, as well as also their distortion emulation, which is a little bit bigger than normal. So I do say bigger, but of course I do mean that in terms of how many options we have there. When you have the option to control the gain as well as the volume, and we have 3 separate different versions of distortion just built in, those kind of things are going to be something that's coming from its connection to Boss, and a company that's really so ingrained in pedals and effects and sounds. Now, you can tell that when Boss made this Katana series, in general the Katana series, but when they came out with bass, they really were aiming to kind of come out with a heavy hitter. Definitely overbuilt, and like I said, for better or for worse, I think in a good way overbuilt, because we have so many different options and so many different things available to it at a price point that really you wouldn't expect it to be at. Typically what we're looking at for the 2 versions, the 110 at the time of filming is around 400 USD, give or take, based on the manufacturer, and the 210 is around 750. Again, these are just the current at the time of filming, and of course those prices can be subject to change based on manufacturers and things of that nature. But for the most part, you're looking at a fairly good price for how much you get out of it. You know, when we're talking about that 750 range for a bass amp, very rarely are you going to be able to get Bluetooth ingenuity, USB interfacing, built-in effects board panels, 3 different types of distortion, a compressor limiter built in, 4-way EQing, mind you, a 4-way EQ that in and of itself has different EQ points for the mids to help it sculpt even more. So for the price point, they really packed it in with how much they wanted to give you at that in general for an amp. Now, I think where it really does shine though is that you can tell there's a lot of forward thinking in the Katana series, especially for the bass. There's a lot of, like I said, Bluetooth interfacing, USB interfacing, built-in onboard effects that can be molded and shaped using a third-party application, going as far as maybe even using your phone. These features are far from being the standard today, but as we start seeing with other manufacturers, it's starting to become more and more commonplace, and they're starting to become more outside of just a niche thing that's being offered in the amp market. So the fact that Boss, in their introduction to the bass series with the Katana, that they're already including it, you can tell that it is forward thinking. Now, where I think it also helps it out is that they didn't lean too heavy into those concepts to the point where this becomes a niche amp, or where there's only certain facets of wanting it or introductory. There's a lot of different effects and a lot of different options, but for the most part, they're all being grounded and rooted around what is essentially a solid bass amp build and a kind of standard build. They didn't try to reinvent the bass amp or break the mold. They took a mold that has been pretty well established by bigger companies in the spectrum like Ampegs, Korgs, Fenders, and from there they added things that possibly could really only be uniquely added with Boss's ingenuity and availability to certain effects and the way that they operate predominantly in pedals. So when we're looking at this Boss Katana, honestly, I think it's a really great amp in general to use for both studio and live setting with all of the different options it offers. But another thing that I think may be slipping away is that it is also, I think, a really good option if you're introductory even as well. Because in addition to all those different effects, you do get if you're not familiar with them, the idea of how to use them. Typically when you're more established, you may already know to have your pedals, to get your distortions, all that good stuff. However, if you're not in a point musician-wise or even in your journey where you want to buy those or can afford to buy those, it is rather convenient knowing that you have 3 different distortions to choose from and up to 60 different effects that can be onboarded into the amp to mess around with. So really also great for a learning curve. So for those that know how to use all these effects and how to sculpt and mold them, you're going to find that you can utilize it in a way that there's a kind of a control that you don't get from a lot of amps in that spectrum. And if you are new, then it's giving you a lot of features to learn how to use so that eventually you can branch away from them being onboarded. I know myself, I learned how to use pedals and delay effects from onboard equipment. So it can definitely be a great transition in your musical journey. Now, for the Katana, what are your thoughts? Have you played it? Have you tried it? Have you been interested in doing it? I personally think that it's something worth looking into. One thing I will tell you right now is that the Katana series does only come in the 110, 210, as I mentioned, so there isn't really a practice consumer level. So if you are buying one, you're probably more looking at it in the studio or a gigging aspect at the very least versus just in practice. Again, that is right now at the time of shooting. But even with that limitation, if you have been looking into a new amp, something for the gig or maybe an extra one in the studio, I think the Katana is definitely something to look into, not just for all the effects, but for all of the things that it can do for your musical journey as well. Once again, this is Carlos with Alamo Music Center. I do want to thank you for watching this and for giving us all the support you have. Hope you enjoyed this review and overtake on the Katana series. You have a great rest of your day.